Better late than early. Doing the right job at the wrong time. This is an interesting topic. You see, we're told in the book Christian Education that parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. As fast as their minds can comprehend it, the parents should open before them God's great book of nature. So here we have described a curriculum for early childhood that, first of all, until the age of 8 or 10, parents should be the only teachers, and the textbook should be nature. And we continue reading here that the only schoolroom for children until 8 or 10 years of age should be in the open air, amid the opening flowers and nature's beautiful scenery, and their most familiar textbook, The Treasures of Nature. Again, a rather interesting curriculum for early childhood. You see, in modern times, we've begun to focus on a very academic focus for early childhood. We've seen a shift. What used to be a very play-based, hands-on environment has become much more focused on academic and book learning. Is that really good for the brain? Well, a lot of research is showing that that's not actually the most beneficial environment for little children. I'm going to touch on some of the research and science here. You can find more information on my website. That's thinkinggeneration.org. You can also go to YouTube and find more videos there. But we're going to touch on a few brief points on this topic. First of all, the disorganization of the brain. When we look at the development of the brain, we find a difference between the right hemisphere and left hemispheres, as well as the frontal lobe. The left hemisphere helps with a lot of the academic things like detail, parts and processes of language, linear patterns, logic, critical thinking, numbers, and reasoning skills. Very important for the classroom. The right hemisphere deals with things more like images and rhythm and emotion and intuition, imagination, creativity, feeling, faith, belief, and large motor control. Yes, you may use the right hemisphere in a lot of academic learning, but you need that left hemisphere. So at what stages do those hemispheres develop? We find that from around 4.5 to 7 or 8 years in girls up until around 9 years or 10, even 10 years in boys, the right hemisphere is focused on development. Whereas the left hemisphere doesn't really begin its major time of development until later, around 7 years in boys and around 7 years in girls and 9 years in boys. So if we're asking, if we're putting children in school or asking them to do a lot of reading and writing and the more academic things prior to that left hemisphere developing, then we start to run into problems. We can't really accelerate learning as we've tried to do often. In fact, if we take a little boy or a little girl in class and we're asking his brain to do something for which it is not ready, the brain will compensate. It will, in other words, use a different area that has developed already, which is not the correct region, and it begins to route the thinking through there, and it forms a habit, a bad habit, an incorrect habit, we should say, of learning, using a wrong brain region for a particular type of learning. Let me just say this simply here. If a task is asked of the brain for which the correct region is not mature, it will form neural routes through lower, more developed sections, resulting in almost permanent organizational damage. So trying to force a child to learn a concept for which they are not ready can actually do damage to the unmyelinated brain. Let me read you a quote here from Dr. Jane Healy, an educational psychologist. In her book, Endangered Minds, she explains this well. Before brain regions are myelinated, they do not operate efficiently. For this reason, trying to make children master academic skills for which they do not have the requisite maturation may result in mixed up patterns of learning. If the correct brain system isn't yet available or working smoothly, forcing may create a functional organization in which less adaptive, lower systems are trained to do the work. Trying to drill higher level learning into immature brains may force them to perform with lower level systems and thus impair the skill in question. Any learning that has to be pushed into a child may end up doing more harm than good. So they may be labeled, they may be treated, they may be tutored later on, but the issue is unchanged. The fact is that schools and children are often on different schedules. Now, it's not just the brain that receives the damage. The eyes can receive some damage also. The ability to use both eyes to focus on a subject, as well as two-dimensional focus, both important for reading, don't fully develop until around age 9. And if we are asking the eye to perform a task, say that differently, we also know that only about 5% of vision actually occurs in your eyes. In other words, your brain does most of the seeing. And Carla Hannaford tells us that for a full vision to occur, information from all cerebral lobes must be accessed. The problem is, what if all cerebral lobes are not developed yet? Then full vision is not occurring. Dr. Raymond Moore explains this when he says, even though a single clear visual image may be received by the eye, a child still may not be able to decode printed material because of deficiencies in organization and interpretation in the central nervous system due to lack of maturation. In other words, the eye needs some time to develop. And if we focus the eye on the up-close reading environment at a young age, it can begin to stress the eye as well as the brain, and it can lead to an inflammation of the eyeball, which can then actually trigger myopia. The development of myopia is very connected to the early reading environment, looking at things up close. Myopia is the most common eye problem in the world. That's nearsightedness. The U.S. is currently around 50% myopic, as well as a lot of more developed countries. But if we compare that to East Asia, we find they are 90% myopic, while the continent of Africa is only 10 to 20% myopic. What would be the difference in comparing these countries? Well, East Asia spends a whole lot more time in study and indoors than the U.S. And of course, of the three, Africa, there are still large populations of indigenous peoples spending a lot of time outside, especially. Do you think that may have something to do with eye health? Absolutely. Research has shown that children who spend less time outside are at a greater risk of developing myopia. So the more time children spend outside, the better their eye health will be. But if we put them in the classroom and tell them to read for hours on end, we're going to be possibly triggering the development of myopia. We also read that light stimulates the release of dopamine in the retina, and this neurotransmitter, in turn, blocks the elongation of the eye during development. Elongation of the eye. Myopia is an elongation of the eye. So light causes the release of a neurotransmitter that blocks the elongation of the eye. Light. How much light? Studies find children need to spend around 3 hours per day under light levels of at least 10,000 lux to be protected against myopia. 3 hours a day. That's a lot of time. But what's 10,000 lux? It's the great outdoors. Go out on a sunny day, stand in the shade, you're getting about 10,000 lux. It's not full sunlight, but it's full daylight. The problem is the average well-lit classroom or office is only about 500 lux on average. Only 500 lux, far below what is necessary for the development of the eye. Now, another problem with the classroom at an early age is the lack of movement and exercise. Exercise is vital for the development of the brain, and yet we tell them to sit still for hours on end. We are hindering their brains from developing. We also know that well, perhaps you've seen. Also, I'm sure we've seen groups of children playing. Are they perfectly quiet? Hardly. Even a little child playing by himself will be talking to himself. Why? That's because children typically think out loud. It's the ability to think internally hasn't been developed yet. So if we tell them to be quiet for hours on end, we are preventing them from engaging in thinking. Now, don't misunderstand me. Children need to learn to sit still and be quiet, yes. But when we do it for hours on end in the classroom, it is preventing the normal development, the necessary development of childhood. Now, of course, many people are concerned about socialization. People think that children need to go and spend time with other children of the same age for proper social development, and studies show that that's not true at all. In fact, children need contact with adults for proper social development, not to mention the emotional development that comes from a secure connection with a parent at a young age. It's vital for development. Now, perhaps a more serious consideration here is the effect on boys. Boys have about a 2-year delay in, or lag in development as compared to girls. I don't like calling it a delay, honestly, because it's not that boys are slow. They just develop differently. There's nothing wrong with that. But because of that 2-year difference, all the negative effects of going to school at an early age will become intensified in the boys. And in fact, today, boys are not learning as well as girls. They receive 70% of the bad grades given to all students. They cause 90% of classroom discipline problems. Boys cause 90% of classroom discipline problems. 80% of all high school dropouts are boys. Millions of boys are on Ritalin and other controlled drugs. 3 out of 4 students labeled learning disabled are boys. Boys are having problems today. Now, I believe that Satan is specifically attacking boys now because he knows that God has designed them to be the spiritual leaders of their homes and of their churches. The devil does not want that to happen. And so this is one of the ways he is attacking them. He is putting them in an environment where they are continually inferior to the girls. Boys can do great at academic learning, but they need some extra time before beginning that. Reading skills can also be affected by early academic training. In fact, studies show that later reading can actually develop, or I should say a later start at reading tends to develop better reading skills. Studies have found, this comes from the Early Childhood Research Quarterly number 28, that the foundation of later reading, and in particular reading comprehension, is language. Now, how do we develop language skills? Conversation, simply talking together, is actually building the foundation for later reading skills. So as we talk together, as we answer the questions that come up, toddlers are great at that. Why? When they ask the questions about, what's this letter? Can you read me this story? What's the name of that book? What's that sign say? Can you teach me how to write my name? Questions like that. Take a moment here and there to teach some reading skills. You don't have to sit them down for hours at a time to teach reading. You can teach it in everyday life, just 1 minute at a time here and there. And many times children can teach themselves how to read when we engage in the environment like that. But if we actually look at the science, research shows that children who start earlier at reading, who begin the reading instruction, are taught reading at an early age, actually have worse reading abilities than those who start later. One study compared 2 groups of children, one starting reading at age 5, another starting at age 7. And it was found that by age 9, the 2 groups had caught up with each other. And by age 11, the group who started later had actually passed up the ones who started earlier in their reading abilities. So success at reading is not assured by an earlier beginning. Now, you may be wondering, though, how will a child catch up? If we start them so much later, how will they ever catch up? That's not a problem at all, because when the brain is ready, it will learn much more efficiently. You're learning through everyday life, of course. It's not that we're keeping books and anything academic away from the child, but we are learning through everyday life. So when the time comes to put it on paper, it will be a seamless and easy transition, and children will actually learn much more quickly and more efficiently when we do begin the academics at a later age. Studies have found, here's one from Dr. Raymond Moore, in a study of 300 individuals who started school at about age 8 or later, all of them quickly caught up with their classes and in most cases performed well above the class average. So there's substantial agreement among school entrance age researchers that children who enter school later are significantly higher in academic achievement than those who enter earlier. And the late starters generally excel in behavior, sociality, and leadership. So starting later is actually for children's benefit. And of course, the most significant factor in this discussion is the development of spirituality. We know that the early years are an important time for the development of spirituality, caused to affect reasoning skills, emotion, relationships, behavior management, language, memory, moral understanding, conscience, and character development. Vital things for the development of a child, vital things in preparing them for heaven, the purpose of true education. And yet these functions, the foundation is laid in the first 7 years of a child's life. We want to focus on what is most important when it counts the most. The academic training can come later, and we will be glad for the extra focus on character development at an early age. But of course, the question may be asked, how can parents follow these principles and still comply with the legal requirements? And that's a good question. There are several things that can be done. I will list 4 things that can be done here. First of all, you want to be knowledgeable about the actual legal requirements. So of course the question would be asked, well, how can a parent follow these principles and still comply with the legal requirements? That's an important question. There are a few things that can be done. First of all, home educate. That's the first step in complying with this principle that parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. So don't focus so much on what you can't do, focus on what you can do. And here in France, it is perfectly legal to homeschool your children. So begin with home education. As part of home education, you will be developing emotional security. This is vital. Emotional security is the foundation of cognitive development. Let me say that differently. Cognitive development, academic learning, is really dependent on a child's sense of emotional security. Emotional security is best developed with a strong and secure connection with mom especially, and dad also. So beginning by home education is the first step in complying with this counsel. And again, we're speaking up until the age of around 8 or 10. The next thing you can do is to be knowledgeable about the legal requirements. Here in France, there is a document, we'll put it on the screen here, which explains clearly what the legal expectations are, what the educational outcomes are that are expected for each child. Look through those carefully and understand and know exactly what is required of you. There's a lot of myths out there. There's a lot of ideas. People say, oh, you have to do this. Oh, you have to do that. Don't believe that. Just go to the documentation and know it for yourself. And you may find things like, a child needs to have certain reading skills, and you think, oh, I have to teach that at an early age. But if you'll notice in this document, it actually says those reading skills are required by the completion of compulsory schooling. So you don't have to teach it early. It can come later. So you look for the loopholes, the little things that you can do to comply with the government regulations, of course, but also follow God's plan and be creative. That brings us to our third point in complying with the state requirements and following God's plan for early childhood education, and that is what we call creative documentation. Creative documentation is where you take the everyday activities that are just happening in everyday life, the cooking, the cleaning, the trips to the grocery store, whatever it may be, and you look at all the learning that can happen through that. You can learn math in the kitchen, you can learn science in the garden, you can learn math and science and art and graphic design and business and accounting just with a trip to the grocery store. You take all those things and you document that as learning opportunities. You document exactly what was learned, the math concepts, the language, the science, all the development that has happened through that activity. And as you document all that, you will be meeting the government standards in a much more brain-friendly way. Finally, engage in hands-on learning environments. More practical ways of learning. Look for ways to teach the same things that the government asks in a practical and hands-on way. It's easy if you're creative. For example, learning math, learning fractions. Go to the kitchen, do a recipe, double a recipe, cut a recipe in half. You're getting fractions that way. Maybe it's learning a second language. Maybe you know some English or some German or a different language. Engage in learning that with your child. Everyday conversation. You don't need to sit down with a textbook. You can just engage in conversation. Now, what you want to do, though, because you're doing creative documentation, you as a parent want to write down what it is that you have learned in an oral and practical way. You document that so that you are fulfilling the state requirements that way. So it's quite easy to fulfill the state requirements. You just have to be a bit creative about it and focus on God's plan and trust that He will work out the details as long as we do all that we can do. Don't get stuck in what you can't do. Focus on what you can and do everything that you can, and the Lord will bless your efforts. I'm Joshua White, Director of A Thinking Generation Ministries. For more information, you can visit our website at athinkinggeneration.org.